Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, by Carroll Quigley. Chapter 18. Southern Asia. Farther west, in Southern Asia, the correctly called Middle East, extending from the Persian Gulf to Burma, American bungling also opened many opportunities for Soviet penetration, which the Communists generally failed to exploit with sufficient skill to earn any significant rewards. The American era in Southern Asia can be expressed very simply. The key to that area was India. The United States acted as if it were Pakistan. The reason for this was equally simple, but should have been sternly resisted, and might have been, except for Dulles. India was determined to be neutral. Pakistan was willing to be an ally of the United States. Dulles tried to make Pakistan the key because he preferred any kind of ally, even a weak one, to a neutral, however strong. But the choice undermined any possible stability in the area and opened it to Soviet penetration. From the broadest point of view, the situation was this. The rivalry between the two superpowers could be balanced and its tensions reduced only by the coming into existence of another great power on the landmass of Eurasia. There were three possibilities of this: a federated and prosperous Western Europe, India, or China. The first was essential. One of the others was highly desirable, and possibly all three might be achievable. But in no case was it essential, or even desirable, for the new great power to be allied with the United States. A strong and prosperous neutral in at least two of the three positions would box in the Soviet Union and force it to seek its needs in an intensive rather than extensive expansion, and in an economic rather than a military direction. A Soviet Union which was not boxed in would expand outward extensively, and by military means, as much as any others. It would seek its needs, as it had done in Eastern Europe in 1945 to 1948, by bringing more resources, including manpower, under its control as satellite areas. If the Soviet Union were boxed in by allies of the United States, it would feel threatened by the United States, and would seek security by more intensive exploitation of its resources in a military direction, and with a natural increase in world tension. If, on the other hand, the Soviet Union were boxed in by at least two great neutral powers, it could be kept from extensive expansion by one, the initial strength of such great powers, and two, the possibility that these powers would ally with the United States if the Soviet Union put pressure on them. On the other hand, in such a situation, the Soviet Union would be likely to turn to intensive expansion within these boundaries in economic and social directions, not only from the demand within the Soviet Union, but also because of its own increased feeling of security from the existence of buffer powers between the United States and itself. Some solution such as this had been directly seen by Marshall and Atkinson in regard to China in 1948 to 1950, but had been destroyed by the aggressive Stalinism of Mao's China and the eras leading to the Korean War. In the West, the possibility had been destroyed by the immediacy of Soviet pressure, which had shifted American emphasis from European Union to American alliance with Europe, and from economic revival there to NATO. And in Southern Asia, the possibility had been lost by Stalin's early pressure on Iran, which led Dulles to regard Pakistan instead of India as the key to the area. The necessity for choice between these two arose from the partition of India before independence in 1947. In India, as in Palestine and earlier in Ireland, partition before independence received a strong impetus from the Round Table Group, and in all three cases it led to horrors of violence. The cause, in all, was the same: Lines which seem to divide different peoples on the map often do not do so on the ground, because peoples are intermingled with each other. There are always third or even fourth groups which belong to neither, and their positions are often marked by separation in levels in a social hierarchy, rather than by separation side by side in geography. In India's case, the partition was a butchery rather than a surgical process. Imposed by the British, it cut off two areas in northwestern and northeastern India to form a new Muslim state of Pakistan, cutting right through the Sikhs in the process. The founders of the two states, Gandhi in India and Jinnah in Pakistan, both died in 1948, the former assassinated by a Hindu religious fanatic, so that the two new nations began under new leaders. In the post-partition confusion, minorities on the wrong side of the lines sought to flee, as refugees, to India or Pakistan, while the Sikhs sought to establish a new homeland for themselves by exterminating the Muslims in East Punjab. In a few weeks, at least 200,000 were killed and 12 million were forced to flee as refugees, in most cases with almost no possessions. An additional problem arose from the Indian princely states. Most of these joined the Dominion in closing their territory, but two acute problems arose. In Hyderabad, where a Muslim prince ruled over a Hindu majority, and in Kashmir, where a Hindu prince ruled over a Muslim majority. Hyderabad was settled when Indian troops invaded and took over the area, but Kashmir, on the border of Pakistan itself, could not be settled in such a summary fashion without precipitating war between the two dominions. Fighting broke out, but was eventually suppressed by the United Nations ceasefire team. At this writing, Kashmir still remains a cause of enmity and controversy unjoined to either state. The death of Jinnah in 1948 left Pakistan, which was so largely his creation, in confusion. Its two sections were separated from each other by 1,100 miles of Indian territory. Its boundaries were irrational. Its economic foundations were torn to shreds by the partition. Raw materials were left separated from their processing plants in India. Irrigation canals separated from their reservoirs. Herds separated from their pasturage. Ports cut off from hinterland, and traders from their markets. Pakistan looked with yearning on Kashmir, but at the same time feared the greater size and population of India, forced by its insecurity to regard the army as the chief representation of the state. It built its unifying ideology on Islam at a time when belief in Muhammad's teachings were dwindling everywhere. It had no recognized capital, but began administration from Karachi and could not agree on a constitution until February 1956. By that time, Pakistan was filled with corruption and unrest. Its first 5-year plan for economic development was breaking down. Foreign exchange was lacking, and inflation, with food hoarding, threatened. The 5-year plan, 1955 to 1960, failed to make any improvement in living conditions, since its disappointing 2% a year increase in production was absorbed by an increase of similar size in population. In October 1958, martial law was established, and the commander-in-chief, General Muhammad Ayub Khan, became president and quasi-dictator as martial law administrator. In the next 4 years, October 1958 to June 1962, under military rule, Pakistan was put on a more hopeful course. A sweeping land reform program restricted owners to 500 acres of irrigated or 1,000 acres of non-irrigated land, with the surplus distributed to existing tenants or other peasants. Former landlords received compensation for lost lands and long-term bonds. Extensive efforts were made to establish cooperative villages, copied from those of Yugoslavia, and to reduce the birth rate. The second five-year plan, 1950 to 1965, got off to a good start with extensive foreign aid, including that of the World Bank, the United States, a European consortium, and increasing help from the Soviet Union. In March 1962, a new constitution with a strong presidency, reserved for 3 years to Ayub Khan, was announced. Martial law ended and elections were held. But the precarious international position of the country, going back to its original rejection of neutrality, continued. This rejection of neutrality was based on a mixture of resentment toward India and Afghanistan, a vague feeling of fellowship with other Muslim states of the Near East, and a basic instability of political life. These impelled Pakistan toward a more dynamic foreign policy than India, and led it to involvement in the Dulles network of treaties, including SEATO and CENTRO. This network of treaties in Dulles's eyes was aimed at the Soviet Union, but in Karachi, it was much more likely to be viewed in terms of Pakistan's enmities with Afghanistan and India. This, in turn, tended to increase Soviet influence in Kabul and in Delhi. The Kremlin made vigorous protests against the Pakistan-Turkish Treaty of Cooperation of April 1954, the Pakistan-Iraqi Alliance of January 1955, the United States-Pakistan negotiations for military cooperation of 1954 to 1955, and above all, against the Baghdad Pact of November 1955. The growing militarization of Pakistan, not only from its domestic instability, but from the advent of American arms, led to a growing Indian concentration of its military forces in the West. This, in turn, was interpreted in Pakistan as a threat to Kashmir and drove tension upward. At the same time, Afghanistan, whose independence of Russian influence had been guaranteed by the British position in India for over a century, found itself, at the British withdrawal, exposed to increasing pressure both from the Soviet Union and from Pakistan. The nature of these pressures may be seen in the fact that a concession to France to explore Afghanistan for oil in 1952 had to be cancelled because of Russian protests. On the other hand, American military aid to Pakistan was protested by Kabul and led it to accept Soviet aid agreements in 1954. Afghanistan was a multinational, or rather multi-tribal state, in which the chief group was the Pashto. Creation of Pakistan in 1948 left almost half this language group in Pakistan, and Afghanistan at once began to agitate for self-determination for the Pashto. Success in this endeavor would create a new Pashtuni state, which would absorb much of western Pakistan and would extend from Soviet Central Asia to the Arabian Sea. The Russians naturally supported these claims to retaliate against Pakistan cooperation with the United States and to open a Russian outlet to the Southern Ocean. In counter-retaliation, in 1955, Pakistan tightened its control over its Pashto areas and closed the Afghan border, stopping all Afghan commerce to the south and leaving Afghanistan almost completely dependent on Soviet outlets. This opened the way to a great increase in communist influence, including that of Soviet satellites in Afghanistan. These relations were sealed by a state visit of Khrushchev and Bulganin to Kabul in November 1955. From this came a Soviet loan of $100 million, of which $40 million for arms, at 2% interest over 30 years. Large amounts of Soviet arms and hundreds of Czech technicians began to move into Afghanistan. For the Soviet Union, the critical area in Asia was that on either side of the Caspian Sea. That was the only frontier where no buffer state stood between the Western Bloc and the Soviet Union itself. This was a consequence of Stalin's aggressive threats to Iran and Turkey in 1946, which had driven them into alliance with the West. But it went far back in history to the old Russian ambitions to reach the Persian Gulf and the Aegean Sea. Because of the danger to the Soviet Union in that area, especially to the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus, the Kremlin was for a long time reluctant to bypass the Turkish-Iran-Pakistan barrier to seek to intervene in the troubled conditions of the Arab Near East. Those conditions obviously provided ample opportunities for Soviet economic, ideological, and political disturbances, which could be injurious to the West, especially to Western Europe, which was so dependent upon Middle East petroleum supplies. Stalin never was willing to intervene in any area which could not be directly accessible to Soviet troops, and once his territorial ambitions in northeast Turkey and northwest Iran were defeated in 1946 to 1947, he left the whole Near East relatively alone. This condition continued almost unchanged in spite of domestic disturbances of a major character in Iran and among the Arab states, particularly Egypt. It was not until the summer of 1955 that the new Khrushchev effort to exploit the troubles of the Near East in order to build up local nationalism against the West was made possible by the growing instability of conditions in the area, and was called forth by Dulles's persistent efforts to organize the area on an anti-Soviet basis. Thus, in this area, as in southeastern and southern Asia earlier, the American insistence on the non-committed nations adopting anti-Soviet lines opened the way for the Soviet to pose as the friend of such nations by supporting their neutralism. In Iran and Turkey, already burned by Soviet fire, this effort was a failure. But south of this barrier, the situation in the Arab world was, from Moscow's point of view, far more promising. There is little doubt that the Soviet decision to upset the apple cart in the Near East by selling arms to the Arab states was a reprisal for Dulles's long-drawn efforts to get the northern tier of Near Eastern states, Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan, into the Western Bloc. These efforts began as far back as May 25, 1950, when the Western powers offered to sell arms to the Near Eastern states themselves, if the recipients would guarantee not to use such arms for aggression. Fortunately, nothing came from this foolish offer, because the Arab states refused to promise not to use any arms against Israel. In fact, they were very definite that they would do just that as soon as they could untangle their own intra-Arab squabbles. In the interval, Iran and Egypt had domestic disturbances which created severe international repercussions. Until recent years, Iran remained a fairly typical underdeveloped Muslim country, but with distinctive features of its own from the fact that it was not an Arab but an Indo-European country, and had an ancient heroic cultural tradition of Persian origin, which was distinctively different from the Arab traditions of the Near East. It shared, however, the tribal, patriarchal, pastoral, and poverty-stricken nature of the Near East, and was included in a common geographic pattern by semi-aridity, emphasis on animal husbandry, survival of nomadic life, and the fact that its chief natural resource was oil. Although most of Iran's inhabitants are Muslim, only about 1 in 10 speaks Arabic as his primary language, while over half speak Persian. The rest speak a variety of dialects, of which about a fifth are Turkic. Only about 1 person in 7 is literate, usually in Persian, using Arabic script. Most persons know more than 1 language, and it is not uncommon to speak 1 language in the family, write a different language, and pray in a third. At the end of World War II, about 80% of the population were peasants, in spite of the fact that geographic and social conditions made agriculture a most difficult way of life. Only about 1/10 of the land was tilled, and only half of that at any one time, while another 10th was used for grazing. The rest, amounting to 4/5, was almost entirely useless, being either mountainous or arid. Moreover, the peasants who tilled the land were much oppressed by heavy rents to absentee landlords, who also controlled, as separate rights, essential access to water. Only about 1/7 of the land was owned by the peasants who worked it, and that was either more remote or of poorer quality. These burdens on the land were often so heavy that peasants retained little more than 1/5 of what they produced. In consequence, many peasants had to supplement their incomes by work as laborers, as small traders, or by village handicrafts. Generally, the rigid categories of economic activities in which we think did not exist in Iran, so that most people had a variety of activities as peasants, herdsmen, traders, government employees, laborers, and soldiers, moving seasonally or intermittently from one activity to another. Even the landlords were, as often as not, government employees, moneylenders, traders, or all combined. This fluidity of economic functions was more than canceled out by social rigidity. Family and personal relationships were rigid and hierarchical, and the former were often tribal in nature. The whole of Iranian life was imprinted with leader-follower characteristics of a very personal character, with loyalty and honor, two of the outstanding features of all human relationships. Where these did not operate, human relationships were precarious and filled with suspicion, so that many of the patterns of life which form the modern world, such as political and public relationships and impersonal business relationships, were very weak and without stable principles, fell readily into nepotism and corruption. This leadership principle in Iranian social life supported a privileged ruling group or elite which dominated the country, made up of landowners and gentry, with substantial interests in business, especially government contracts. It was also the chief source of high government officials and of army officers. The members of this elite, mostly resident in Tehran, have, in most cases, powerful local interests of an economic, family, and social kind in various provinces, and are usually the leaders of these districts. Between this elite and the peasantry is a small middle class of businessmen, professional persons, bureaucrats, and educated people who generally differ from the elite because they are less wealthy, have a few, if any, personal followers, and lacking personal support in land or family, are much less likely to be associated with local districts. This middle class is the principal source of nationalist feeling. One of the chief features of recent Persian life has been the way in which the Shah has shifted the basis of his support from the elite landed group to this growing middle class, and to those whose social position is based on know-how and training rather than on wealth and family. Chief roles in this shift have been played by the army and the agrarian question. A century ago, political power in Iran was concentrated in the hands of the autocratic Shah, supported by the interlocking elite of landlords and army officers. At that time, the Shah, in fact, was not Persian, but Turkic. The Qajar dynasty of 1796 to 1925. It was a period in which Persia was a zone of political conflict between the imperialism of Tsarist Russia and that of Victorian Britain. On two occasions in 1907, and again in 1942, these two powers made agreements setting up spheres of influence in Iran. Since these agreements were reached because of their common enmity toward Germany, it was almost inevitable that these agreements would break down and rivalry be resumed on the defeat of Germany in 1918 and again in 1945. It was almost equally inevitable that Iran should seek support from some outside power against the joint or parallel Anglo-Russian pressure, as it did from Germany before 1914, before 1941, and from the United States since 1946. Iran's ability to resist any outside pressure was reduced by the general weakness and confusion of its own governmental system. This was a personal royal autocracy resting upon a feudalized substructure of tribal chiefs, great landlords, and religious leaders. Even after the establishment of a constitutional government and a national assembly, the Majlis, in 1906. The strong role played by personal influence, especially that of the Shah, prevents the formation of real political parties or the functioning of the governmental structure as a system of principles, laws and conventions, and established relationships. In the days of his autocratic power before 1914, the Shah sought to raise funds for his personal use by selling concessions and monopolies to foreign groups. Most of these, such as those on tobacco or sugar, were exploitative of the Iranian peoples and were very unpopular. Of these concessions, the most significant was one granted in 1901 to William Knox D'Arcy for the exclusive right to exploit all stages of the petroleum business in all Iran except the 5 provinces bordering on Russia. The control of this concession shuffled from one corporate entity to another until 1909. It came into possession in the new Anglo-Persian Oil Company. This company established the world's largest refinery at Abadan on the Persian Gulf, and by 1914 signed an agreement with the British government, which made it the chief source of fuel for the British Navy. It gradually extended its activities through a myriad of subsidiary corporations throughout the world, and simultaneously came to be controlled through secret stock ownership by the British government. At the end of World War I, Iran was a battleground between Russian and British armed forces. By 1920, the withdrawal of British forces and the Bolshevization of Russia left the anti-Bolshevik Russian Cossack Brigade as the only significant military force in the country. The chief Iranian officer in that force, Reza Pahlavi, in the course of 1921 to 1925, gradually took over control of the government and eventually deposed the incompetent 28-year-old Shah Ahmed. Reza Shah Pahlavi followed the pattern of modernization established by Kemal Ataturk in Turkey, but was constantly hampered by inadequate financial resources, by the underdeveloped economic system, and by the backward social development of the area. Nevertheless, he did a great deal of uncoordinated modernization, especially in education, law, and communications. His chief aim was to break down tribalism and localism and to establish national loyalty to a unified Iran. To this end, he defeated the autonomous tribes, settled nomadic groups in villages, shifted provincial boundaries to break up local loyalties, created a national civil service and police force, established a national registration with identity cards for all, and used universal conscription to mingle various groups in a national army. One of his chief efforts to improve communications and transportation culminated in the Trans-Iranian Railway from the Persian Gulf to the Caspian Sea, built in 11 years, 1929 to 1940, at a cost of about $150 million. Roads were constructed where only local paths had existed before, and some effort was made to establish industries to provide work for a new urban class. All these projects required money, which was very difficult to find in a country of limited natural resources. The chief resource, oil, was tied up completely in the concession held by the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, later called Anglo-Iranian or AIOC, with the inevitable result that it became the target of the Iranian nationalist desire for additional development funds. In this struggle, the older elite of Iranian life, including the Shah, the army, and the landlords, would have been satisfied with a renegotiated deal with AIOC yielding additional funds to Iran. But the newer urban groups of professional and commercial origin combined with the religious agitators to demand the complete removal of foreign economic influence by nationalization of the petroleum industry. In this division within Iran, control of the situation gradually moved from the older elite to the newer nationalist groups, for a variety of reasons. The years of the World Depression, the financial crisis, and the Second World War greatly intensified all the objectionable features of the AIOC system and, at the same time, seemed to show that no new agreement with the company could remedy the objections. Such a new agreement had been made in 1933, but the situation became worse from the Iranian nationalist point of view. Accordingly, when the government in 1950 tried to obtain a new supplemental agreement, nationalist feeling rose quickly against it and demanded complete nationalization of the oil business instead. In June 1950, the Shah put in as prime minister his man, General Ali Razmara, formerly chief of the general staff, to force through the supplemental agreement. Opposing groups introduced nationalization bills in opposition to the government. Gradually, the nationalization forces began to coalesce about a strange figure, Dr. Mohammad Mosaddegh, of an old, wealthy, landed family, which had served the Qajar dynasty as ministers of finance since the 18th century. Mosaddegh was a westernizer with an earned doctorate in economics from a Swiss university, a man of great personal courage and few personal ambitions or desires, who was convinced that national independence could be established and the obvious corruption of Iranian political life eliminated only by the recovery of Iranian control of its own economic life by nationalization of AIOC. Politically, he was a moderate, but his strong emotional appeal to Iranian nationalism encouraged extremist reactions among his followers. Long and fruitless discussions between AIOC and the Iranian government, with constant interference by the British government, led to stalemate. The company insisted that its status was based on a contractual agreement which could not be modified without its consent, while the British government maintained that the agreement was a matter of international public law, like a treaty, which it had a right to enforce. The Iranian government declared that it had the right, as a sovereign state, to nationalize an Iranian corporation operating under its law on its territory, subject only to adequate compensation and assumption of its contractual obligations. The Iranian nationalist agreements against the company were numerous and detailed. 1. It had promised to train Iranians for all positions possible, but instead had used these only in menial tasks, trained few natives, and employed many foreigners. 2. It had reduced its payments to Iran, which were based on its profits, by reducing the amount of its profits by bookkeeping tricks. For example, it sold oil at very low prices to wholly owned subsidiaries outside Iran or to the British Navy, allowing the former to resell at world prices so that the AIOC made small profits while the subsidiaries made very large profits, not subject to Iranian royalty obligations. Iran believed that profits of such wholly owned subsidiaries were really part of AIOC and should fall under the consolidated balance sheet of AIOC and thus make payments to Iran. But as late as 1950, AIOC admitted that the accounts of 59 such dummy corporations were not included in the AIOC accounts. 3. AIOC generally refused to pay Iranian taxes, especially income tax, but paid such taxes to Britain. At the same time, it calculated the Iranian profit royalties after such taxes, so that the higher British taxes went, the less the Iranian payment became. In effect, thus, Iran paid income tax to Britain. In 1933, AIOC paid £305,418 in British taxation and £274,412 in Iranian taxes. In 1948, the two figures were £28,310,353 and £1,369,328. 4. The payment to Iran was also reduced by putting profits into reserves or into company investments outside Iran, often in subsidiaries, and calculating the Iranian share only on the profits distributed as dividends. Thus, in 1947, when profits were really £40.5 million, almost £14.9 million went to British income tax. £11.5 million went to reserves. Over £7.1 million went to stockholders, of which £3.3 million to the British government, and only $7.1 million to Iran. If the payment to Iran had been calculated before taxes and reserves, it would have been at least £6 million more that year. 5. Moreover, AIOC was exempt from Iranian customs tariffs on goods necessary to its operation brought into the country. Since it considered everything it brought in, whatever it was, to be necessary, it deprived Iran of about £6 million a year by this. 6. The company paid only a very small portion of the social costs of its operations in Persia, drawing many persons to arid and uninhabited portions of the country, and then providing very little of the costs of housing, education, or health. 7. The AIOC, as a member of the International Petroleum Cartel, reduced its oil production in Iran and thus reduced Iran's royalties. 8. The AIOC continued to calculate its payments to Iran in gold at £8 10 shillings per ounce for years after the world gold price had risen to £13 an ounce, while the American corporation Aramco in Saudi Arabia raised its gold price on demand. 9. The AIOC's monopoly on oil export from Iran prevented development of other Iranian oil fields in areas outside the AIOC concession. As a consequence of all these activities, the Iranian nationalists of 1952 felt angered to think that Iran had given up 300 million tons of oil over 50 years and received £105 million, while Britain had invested only £20 million and obtained about £800 million in profits. The Iranian opposition to nationalization was broken in March 1951, when the Prime Minister, Ali Rasmara, and his Minister of Education were assassinated within a space of 2 weeks. The nationalization law was passed the following month, and at the same time, at the request of the Majlis, the Shah appointed Mosaddegh, Prime Minister, to carry it out. This was done with considerable turmoil, which included strikes by AIOC workers against misstymied British wage cuts, anti-British street riots, and the arrival of British gunboats at the head of the Persian Gulf. Rather than give up the enterprise or operate it from the Iranian government, AIOC began to curtail operations and ship home its engineers. On May 25, 1951, it appealed to the International Court of Justice, in spite of Iranian protests, that the case was a domestic one, not international. Only on July 22, 1952, did the court's decision uphold Iran's contention by refusing jurisdiction. At first, the United States, and especially its ambassador in Tehran, supported the Iranian position. It feared that British recalcitrance would drive Iran toward Russia, and was especially alarmed at the possibility of any landing of British forces, since this would allow the Soviet Union to invade the North Iranian provinces, as provided in the Soviet-Iran Treaty in 1921. However, it soon became evident that the Soviet Union, while supporting Iran's position, was not going to interfere. The American position then became increasingly pro-British and anti-Mosaddegh. This was intensified by the shift in administration from Truman to Eisenhower early in 1953, and by the pressure on the American government by the International Petroleum Cartel. At the same time, the American oil companies, which had briefly hoped that they might replace AIOC in the Persian area, decided that their united front with AIOC in the world cartel was more valuable to them. This world oil cartel had developed from a tripartite agreement signed on September 17, 1928 by Royal Dutch Shell, Anglo-Iranian, and Standard Oil. The 3 signers were Sir Henry Dieterding of Shell, Sir John, later Lord Cadman, of AIOC, and Walter C. Teagle of ESO. These agreed to manage oil prices on the world market by charging an agreed fixed price plus freight costs, and to store surplus oil which might weaken the fixed price level. By 1949, the cartel had its members, the 7 greatest oil companies of the world: Anglo-Iranian, Royal Dutch Shell, ESO, Calso, Sukhoni Vacuum, Gulf, and Texaco. Excluding the United States domestic market, the Soviet Union, and Mexico, it controlled 92% of the world's reserves of oil, 88% of the world's production, 77% of the world's refining capacity, and 70% of the world's tonnage in ocean tankers. As soon as Britain lost its case in the International Court of Justice, and it became clear that Iran would go ahead with its nationalization, Britain put into effect a series of reprisals against Iran, which rapidly crippled the country. Iranian funds in Britain were blocked. Its purchases in British-controlled markets were interrupted, and its efforts to sell oil abroad were frustrated by a combination of the British Navy and the World Oil Cartel, which closed its sales and distribution facilities to Iranian oil. These cut off a substantial portion of the Iranian government's revenues and forced a drastic curtailment of government expenditures. To deal with this situation, especially to cut the military budget, Mosaddegh, in July 1952, asked for full powers from the Assembly. He was refused and resigned, but the Ahmed Ghaffam government, which replaced him, lasted only 6 days, resigning under pressure of pro-Mossadegh street riots. Back in office, Mossadegh obtained dictatorial power for 6 months. He broke off diplomatic relations with the British, closed down 9 British consular offices, deported various British economic and cultural groups, and dismissed both the Senate and the Iranian Supreme Court, which were beginning to question his actions. By that time, summer 1953, almost irresistible forces were building up against Mossadegh, since lack of Soviet interference gave the West full freedom of action. The British, the AIOC, the World Petroleum Cartel, the American government, and the older Iranian elite led by the Shah combined to crush Mossadegh. The chief effort came from the American Super-Secret Intelligence Agency, CIA, under the personal direction of its director, Allen W. Dulles, brother of the Secretary of State. Dulles, as a former director of the Schroeder Bank in New York, was an old associate of Frank C. Tyarch's, a partner in the Schroeder Bank in London since 1902, and a director of the Bank of England in 1912 to 1945, as well as Lazard Brothers Bank and the AIOC. It will be recalled that the Schroeder Bank in Cologne helped to arrange Hitler's ascension to power as chancellor in January 1933. Managing Mossadegh's fall in August 1953 was considerably easier, since he left his defense wide open by an attack on the prerogatives of the Iranian army, apparently in the belief that the army would be prevented from moving against him by his influence over the mobs in the streets of Tehran. But throughout the Near East, street mobs are easily roused and directed by those who are willing to pay, and Dulles had the unlimited secret funds of the CIA. From these, he gave $10 million to Colonel H. Norman Schwarzkopf, former head of the New Jersey State Police, who was in charge of training the Imperial Iranian Gendarmerie. And this was judiciously applied in ways which changed the mob's tune considerably from July to August 1953. The whole operation was directed by Dulles himself from Switzerland, where he was visited by Schwarzkopf, the American ambassador to Tehran, Loy Henderson, and messengers from the Shah in the second week of August 1953. Mossadegh purged the army of opposition elements without complete success in the spring of 1953, going so far as to arrest the chief of staff on March 1st. In July, he sought to bypass the assembly and demonstrate his irresistible popular support by having all his supporters resign from the Majlis, thus paralyzing its operations, and held a plebiscite in August to approve his policies. The official vote in the plebiscite was about 2 million approvals against 1,200 disapprovals, but Mossadegh's days were numbered. On August 13th, the Shah precipitated the planned anti-Mossadegh coup by naming General Vassallah Zahedi as prime minister and sent a messenger dismissing Mossadegh. The latter refused to yield and called his supporters into the streets, where they rioted against the Shah, who fled with his family to Rome. 2 days later, anti-Mossadegh mobs supported by the army defeated Mossadegh's supporters in Tehran, killing several hundred. Mossadegh was forced out of office and replaced by General Zahedi. The Shah returned from Italy on August 22nd. The fall of Mossadegh ended the period of confusions which had ensued since the forced abdication of Reza Shah in 1941. From 1953 on, the Shah and the army, backed by the conservative elite, controlled the country and the docile Majlis. 2 weeks after the Shah's counter-coup, the United States gave Iran an emergency grant of $45 million, increased its annual economic aid payment to $23 million, and began to pay $5 million a month in mutual security funds. These payments reached a total of $250 million over 5 years. In return, Iran became a firm member of the Western Bloc, joined the Baghdad Pact Central Treaty Organization in 1955, and provided a close base for surreptitious actions, such as U-2 overflights, against the Soviet Union. The communist-controlled Tudeh Party, the only political party in Iran with the established doctrine and organized structure of such a party in the Western sense, had been officially banned in 1949, but had supported Mosaddegh from underground, where it was relentlessly pursued after 1953. By 1960, the Shah felt his position sufficiently strong to try to pursue a policy of his own, and began to shift his alignment from the older elite group of landlords and army toward the more progressive groups of urban middle-class professional peoples which had supported Mosaddegh. The chief evidence of this was an effort to adopt, more or less, as his personal policy, a program of agrarian reform which sought to restrict each landlord's holdings to a single village, taking all excess lands over for government payments spread over 10 years, and granting the lands to the peasants who work them in return for payments spread over 15 years. The Shah's own estates were among the first to be distributed, but by the end of 1962, over 5,000 other villages had also been granted to their peasants. In the meantime, the oil dispute was settled by a compromise in October 1954. The exploitation and marketing of Iran's oil was taken over by a consortium of existing petroleum companies from the World Cartel and some American independents, with a 40% interest held by AIOC itself. The previous disputes were compromised without too much difficulty. Once it was recognized that both sides had a common interest in preserving the world structure of managed oil prices in order to ensure substantial incomes to both. The incomes to Iran were considerably increased, averaging about $250 million or more a year. Or 1075 in the PDF.